I had a ball being on the school board. The school board represents, obviously, the ultimate volunteer and the ultimate person that has to make the decisions to improve a school district. And in particular, Seattle, as we look at 1/4 of the students are Asian American, but yet they had no say-so in school policy. The history of Seattle schools was that not one Asian American was ever on the board, and it's over 100-something years. And so this was something where Asian Americans had applied before and to run and didn't win. And there was a common thought that an Asian American could not win in a race for school board. And I saw that as a challenge because I didn't believe that. I didn't believe that at all, because you had Asian Americans that ran for city council and won. You had them run for other issues and they won. So why is it that people are saying in the community that Asians can't win as a school board member? And so I decided to run, but not just to be a representative of the Asian community, but to also take a look at how schools affect all of our kids. And that if we want a strong city, we have to have a strong public education system. And I wanted to make sure that we had that here in Seattle. As a side thing, being Asian Americans, I understood the issues that were coming up. I understand that the Asian students were not being given the same kind of help and assistance as other students were getting. And we're simply, when we looked at hiring and we looked at counselors and so forth, basically counselors were hired based on whoever was going to complain the loudest. And many times Asian Americans were not complaining the loudest. So as a school board member, I was hoping to be able to level out that playing field and to look at all the different issues and to make sure that people were not being left behind. I had an enjoyable time being on the school board because of the issues affected all students and affected the entire cities. Obviously, one of the key issues was busing. The busing issues was not necessarily meant for Asians. It was black and white, clearly. But in Seattle, because Asians were 1/4, Asians were the largest population enrollment in Seattle public schools, it had to play a strong part. And so I'll give you an example of a thing that was discriminatory. What they did in the early days was take the bilingual programs, which their bilingual programs now different because you have the African and the Latinos. But before when they started the program, the busing program, probably 98% of the students were Asian. And so what they did was they put the bilingual programs in white neighborhoods and so forth. So you took your very vulnerable kids who didn't speak English, didn't know the culture, little kids and so forth. And they had the long bus ride from the Rainier Beach area and so forth all the way to the north end. And the way it works is that if you had more minorities going there, then you could have more whites going there. So they did this as a way to keep whites from moving out. And then white students got to stay there at the expense of the Asian kids. And so bilingual programs were put not where they lived, but in strategic white neighborhoods, like Laurelhurst had a huge program. That way it allowed white kids to stay there. And then, the Asians left because they're on the bus. So get rid of them. But we can keep them there in school because it works to their advantage to have them. So that whole system was a discriminatory practice. Being on the school board, was able to see that pretty clearly and so forth. And so we made those changes. And we made those changes by looking at where we were placing programs and pulling them back closer to home. So those young elementary school, because high schools could move, and high school students I wasn't as concerned about, but I was concerned about the 5-year-old that didn't speak English and all of a sudden has to go on a bus in a strange country and so forth. So we opened up some of the schools in the South End where kids lived and started to be able to let them have the bilingual programs right there, such as Beacon Elementary, the Maple Elementary School, Wing Luke, those areas right there. And consequently, those schools were the schools that then started gaining in enrollment. Because as you look at school closures, because when I went to school in the Seattle Public Schools, there was 100,000 students. When I got on the school board, it was only 39,000. You could see how that baby boom era really had come and gone. But when I left the schools, after 8 years on the board, it had gone back up to 49,000. And I like to think that I had something to do with it as we looked at the whole issue of white flight as well as Asian flight and the flight of medium-income families to the suburbs and so forth, was looking at our entire system and seeing whether or not we can make those improvements which is something I think that we were able to do. We look at budgeting and so forth in terms of programs, who was getting more of the dollars and so forth. And it was clearly the white schools, white impacted schools were getting more of the budget. And you say, well, why? Well, they have more kids. Well, it's because you moved some of those other kids up there. And then your schools are bigger, and the poor minority schools and so forth were coming smaller. So they were getting less dollars and so forth. But that's where primarily the minority kids were at. At the early days, the busing program was supposed to be 1-to-1. One minority kid goes from south end to the north end, one white kid. That didn't work. That didn't happen, and so forth. And the white kid would be able to stay up there a little bit longer, go to a private school. That's a stereotype that they all have the finances, but they had a little bit more finance than some of the South End kids, and so forth. And that's just a fact in terms of incomes, levels. So they had more options. They could go to a private school, wait out, and then as more kids came in late to school, they were primarily minority kids. They got put into the North End. Boom, that opens up a space now for a white kid. So the white kids then would get out of the private schools and transfer right into the school. So they got into the schools. And so those schools became stronger, and money followed the kids. They got more money, and so forth. And they did a better job in their education. And the schools that kids left from got weaker and weaker. So we needed to be able to build on both ideas of educating, North End schools as well as South End schools. So how do you do that? Student-weighted formula, and so forth. If a kid comes in with more issues and more problems, that kid ought to have more money attached to it. Because there's a real big difference between a kid who just came from Cambodia and my kids, and so forth, who grew up, with a lot of advantages, and so forth. And should they have the same amount of money from the state to be able to educate both of them? No. The kid that just came from the rural areas of Cambodia with no electricity and so forth, that kid should have more. That kid doesn't speak English, and so forth. So the weighted formula gave more money to those particular kids. So a school district or a particular school had a little bit more dollars to deal with the problems, and so forth. So it had a richer formula, and so forth. And some of the people then wanted to come to that school because it had a richer formula. It had more kids. It had more money. And then it was able to do more things, and so forth. And so it was a way of evening that playing field.